This month, Vintage Port Academy returned to Hong Kong for the third year to organise a series of exclusive tastings and food and wine pairing events for the trade and food and beverage professionals in Hong Kong. Asian Palate had the opportunity to interview Euan Mackay, Sales Director of Symington Family Estates, Nicholas Heath, Marketing Director of Taylor Fladgate in Yeatman, and Jorge Nunes, Winemaker and Asia Market Manager of Symington Family Estates. In this 15-minute video, they will take us through a journey to understand the world of vintage port and its opportunities in Asia.
Where port comes from is in the northeast of Portugal, and it's an inland area. It's about 100 kilometers from the ocean, and what makes it special is that it's very mountainous, and the climate there is dry and hot, so it produces very concentrated, very long-lasting wines.
To be able to cope with the extremely harsh conditions, the heat in the summer and the cold weather in the winter. These grape varieties, which are indigenous to the region, possibly the most famous one is Touriga Nacional, supported by Touriga Franca. Those are the two principal ones. And over a period of time, they have evolved so that the dry, for instance, this year we had an extremely dry year, 2012, very dry years, and yet it was still able to produce, these varieties were still able to produce grapes liquid. I think that's one of the key aspects of the grape varieties that we see in the area.
Over 2,000 years, and port as we know it today, of course, developed at the end of the 17th century, so port itself is a historic style of wine. And within the Douro Valley, of course, we have these wonderful old terraces which are built on the mountainsides, which make one of the most extraordinary man-made landscapes and which are protected by the UNESCO World Heritage Scheme. The fundamental difference in terms of winemaking between making port and making a normal wine is that port is fortified. And that means that some grape spirit, which is distilled wine, is added to the port during fermentation, and it stops the fermentation halfway through before all the natural sugar of the grape has turned into alcohol, and therefore it keeps some of the natural sweetness, the natural richness of the grape in the wine.
So these wines vary from ruby styles, reserves, LBVs, to aged tawnies, 10, 20, 30, 40. And all these wines have basically spent, as I said, the entire of their life in wooden cask, gradually evolving. The other area, which is fundamental at the heart of the Vintage Port Academy that we're here to support here, is Vintage Port. And Vintage Port is the iconic wine from the region. These wines are aged in their own bottle. We've got an example here of a single vintage wine. This wine will be bottled 2 years after being picked, after being made, and will spend its entire life in the bottle. These wines are made for aging. They're traded around the world, and really are at the sort of the apex of the iconic aspect of port. Also, very, very historically important. These are some of the oldest wines. Some of the first wines that were ever bottled in the cylindrical bottle were vintage ports back in the 1790s.
To develop. Now, sometimes you don't want to drink a whole bottle, and the alternative for that is late bottle vintage. And late bottle vintage is also the wine from a single year, but instead of aging in bottle, it remains in wood for longer. So it's late bottle, but bottled later than a vintage port. And this means that the wine has been aged in contact with the air, and therefore you can just pour a glass and put the cork back in the bottle, and then have another glass a week later, or 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, and the wine will still be in good condition. So you might say that late bottle vintage is for everyday drinking when you just want a glass, and vintage port for special occasions when you have your friends and you want to enjoy a whole bottle of this magnificent
practical difference, if you like. The vintage port will always be bottled with a proper driven cork, a wine cork. The LBVs will have what we call a stopper cap, stopper T-top. It means that you can take the cork out and then put it back in. That's a very simple way of recognising whether it's a vintage port or actually a wine that is late bottle vintage and therefore can be consumed. The consumer to understand where the sediment is. The vintage port during its aging process will drop a sediment in the bottle which needs to be decanted. And if you can think of the bottle will be lying like this in a cellar, the residue of the wine that will lie on the bottom. So the white paint would indicate to you where that sediment will be sitting. So when you're decanting it, you would always naturally decant it with the white paint upwards so that you don't disturb the sediment which is lying on this side.
Vintage port as a category is gaining increasing attention and demand in emerging markets in Asia. What are the challenges and market opportunities for vintage port in the world's fastest growing wine market? How can port find its own place on the Chinese dining table? Euan and Jorge are going to explain to us further.
Where we see growth is through Hong Kong, and particularly in mainland China, where vintage port is beginning, or we're very slowly beginning through the Vintage Port Academy, to increase the knowledge and profile of the category. We would have to add Taiwan. Taiwan is a market that obviously is relatively small, but has a relatively sophisticated network of distribution and restaurants and wine shops. Therefore, Taiwan is certainly interesting. I would say Japan and Korea, both markets which have an interest in wine. Essentially, any market that enjoys red wines has a developing culture and interest in wine is a potential market for vintage port, because we're ultimately a fine wine. Is education. I think one of at the very heart of the Vintage Port Academy, the reason we set it up 3 years ago, was to improve increase the visibility and the understanding of the category. Not enough people now understand it. So I think the key challenge for us is to get out to try and encourage the sommeliers and those people in the trade to present port confidently and with knowledge. And I think that's what it's all about, and that's what.
From our experience, we believe that the Chinese are actually the best to pair with Chinese food in general. A ruby would go more with sort of meat, more strong like beef or game, but the Chinese would go best with more milder food, sweeter dishes as well. Some of the examples that we found, as odd as it may sound sometimes, for example, Shanghainese food, we tend to believe that it works great with Chinese, particularly the 10-year-old and 20 years old Chinese plates. For instance, hairy crab. I know we're basically at the beginning of the season of hairy crab, and as soon as we came to China and we saw the hairy crab consumption with the yellow wine, there are quite a few similarities between yellow wine and tawny ports, 10-year-old, 20-year-old. So we thought, why not? Let's give it a try. And actually, the result has been quite fantastic, and consumers actually respond to that. I'm not sure if this is, finally we found it. Let's wait and see. But at least we have something in common to work with. Peking duck, for example, is a very good option for a 10-year-old as well. For example, more closer to here, Hong Kong, Cantonese roast pork belly with that sort of crispy skin. It's absolutely beautiful with a 10-year-old. That seems to work perfectly. All ports can be enjoyed by their own, either before the meal, as a French drink, as an aperitif, or more traditional markets, in the UK or the US, in Portugal, we will mostly drink after dinner. But late afternoon or warm afternoon, chilled port, or late evening, or at night, you're reading a book, you're relaxing. I mean, there are many occasions where you can drink a port on its own. Others, obviously, like I said, you can pair. We have four examples of port here today at the show, and there are two that you can drink on their own or paired, which are the 20 years old. So I'll show here a Graham's 20 and a Taylor's 20. These have been aged for 20 years in a barrel, and they're really smooth. They're really easy drinking. They're excellent drank chilled in a nice white wine glass. But as I said, with Peking duck or hairy crab or the Cantonese pork belly, they're great pairings. There are two others which I would not recommend to pair with anything, which are just basically, here we go, which are basically these two right here. These are two absolutely magnificent wines, really rare wines. One is the Graham's 1952, which is as I said, it's very rare. We only had 5-6 barrels of this. It's a few thousand bottles for the whole world. And we actually did it to commemorate the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee. It's an amazing, concentrated, rich, beautiful wine. I would not pair it with anything. Just sip it and enjoy it with a nice cigar if you want. That might be a good option. And the other one is a Taylor Zion, which is a over 150 years old port. I mean, how uncommon is that? How rare is that? It's a port that is basically just thick, syrupy, hugely rich and concentrated, and absolutely magnificent. I mean, paired with something else, I'm absolutely sure that any of these two would kill the food and just destroy any single food, because they're so concentrated with so much flavors and intensity that no food would withstand to that. So by all means, feel free to try out different styles and different things. I think it's great fun of it is trying and enjoying.